The first time I realized the forest could listen, I was standing alone beneath a canopy of pines so tall they looked like ancient pillars holding up the sky. And for a moment, I wasn't sure whether the trembling in my chest came from the cold or from the feeling that something hidden behind the bark and shadows was waiting for me to speak. My name is not one that locals whisper with reverence or fear. I'm no legend, no hero. I'm just a forest ranger who has spent nearly 2 decades walking terrain that most people only see on postcards, working a job that people romanticize until they're actually out here, in the places where the wind changes direction without warning, where sound carries in ways that make you turn your head even when you're alone, and where the darkness beneath the branches feels older than the soil itself. I'm 43 now, based in the northern ranges of Washington state, in a district that holds more stories than hikers. And if you ask the locals, they'll tell you this region has rules. Rules older than government lines, rules older than any map. I didn't believe any of that when I first started. I walked into this job thinking procedures and protocols could control anything. I thought fear came from the unknown and could be solved with experience. But experience teaches you that fear doesn't fade. It evolves. And if you stay in these woods long enough, you start to understand why the old-timers say the pines remember more than people do. Most days, I'm stationed near a small ranger outpost carved into the base of a slope overlooking a valley of dark green treetops. It's the kind of place where dawn rolls in slowly, pushing a soft blue tint through the trees, and dusk clings to the branches like it doesn't want to leave. The nearest town is 15 miles away, a quiet place where folks still lock their doors before sunset, not because of crime, but because their grandparents told them to. When I first arrived, I thought it was superstition. Then I began hearing the whispers, stories shared by people who never raised their voices, people who had seen things they wished they hadn't. There was a man at the diner, an older logger who worked these woods before machines took over. He told me that the forest had moods. Some nights he said it got restless. Other nights it went silent. But the nights that scared him were the ones where the wind blew from the north, because that was when you could hear things under the gusts. Not words, not animals, just things. He told me that once, when he was young, he hid inside a hollow stump because he heard something walking between the trees with footsteps too heavy for any human and too slow for any bear. He never saw it, but he felt it pass. I laughed at the time. I wish I hadn't. My earliest years here were calm. Occasionally, I'd deal with hikers who underestimated the terrain or wildlife that wandered too close to campsites. Routine things, predictable things, nothing that made me doubt myself. But the first time the forest pushed back at me, it didn't start with a scream or a shadow. It started with a sound I could never fully explain, even now. It was late October, one of those cold, brittle nights where the moon appears closer than usual, where you can almost see texture in the light. I had taken the Northern Patrol Trail, a winding stretch that climbs uphill between clusters of old-growth pines. The air was sharp with the scent of sap and frost, and every step I took echoed on the hard earth. I remember feeling unusually alert, as if something was tugging at the edges of my awareness. But it wasn't fear. Not yet. Just a quiet unease that made me breathe deeper, walk slower. Halfway up the ridge, I heard a knock. At first, I thought it was a branch falling, a single hollow thud that reverberated across the slope. Then I heard it again. Thud. Same rhythm, same distance, same deliberate pace. I stopped walking and listened. When you've been in the woods long enough, you learn the language of sound, how far things are, how big they might be, whether the noise is a warning or an accident. But this sound, it didn't fit. It wasn't the shuffle of an animal or the cracking of ice. It wasn't the creak of a tree in wind. It was steady, purposeful, like knuckles tapping wood. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam dissolved into thick darkness. The forest felt too still, too expectant, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My heart beat faster, tightening the air in my chest. I waited for another thud, but instead, I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, sweeping the light in a wide arc, but all I saw were trunks and shadows. My mind tried to rationalize it. Elk? Moose? But no. I've heard those animals my entire career. This wasn't them. Whatever was out there drew in air with a weight that made the branches tremble. A chill crawled up my spine. I took a step backward. The breathing stopped. Then the knock sounded again, this time right in front of me, though I saw nothing. And something inside me shifted. That fragile line between confidence and instinct snapped. For the first time in my life as a ranger, I felt doubt. A sharp, unwelcome doubt that whispered, maybe I wasn't the one in control here. Maybe I was being watched. Maybe I had walked into something's territory. I don't remember deciding to move. My legs just carried me downhill with brisk, measured steps. I didn't run. Running in the dark is a good way to break an ankle or lose your direction. But I didn't linger, either. I listened the entire time, waiting for that breathing to return, for another knock, for footsteps following me, yet nothing came. By the time I reached the outpost, the forest behind me seemed perfectly normal again. Peaceful. Innocent. But I wasn't. I lay awake that night, replaying the sounds in my mind until the rhythm of the knocks blended into the beating of my own heart. I told myself it could have been a tree shifting in the cold, or the echo of something distant, or just my tired mind tricking me. That's how denial works. It gives you excuses to hold on to, even when your instincts tug at your sleeve, begging you to listen. The next morning, I returned to the same trail, half expecting to find tracks in the frost, some clue to ease my mind. But the ground was smooth, untouched. The area felt washed clean, as if whatever had been there the night before knew how to move without leaving a trace. I should have taken the hint. I should have avoided that trail for a while. But pride dulls caution, and I refused to let fear root itself inside me. So I went back the following night, and the one after that, and the one after that. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then came the 4th, and that was the night everything changed. The 4th night was colder than the others, the kind of cold that feels less like weather and more like something inhaling the warmth around you. My breath lingered in long clouds as I climbed the ridge trail again, the frost crunching softly under each step. I hadn't told anyone about the knocks or the breathing, not because I wanted to be brave, but because I feared the truth that admitting it out loud might bring. If I said it, then I had to believe it. And if I believed it, I had to face the possibility that something in these woods wasn't supposed to be here. The sky overhead was clear. A sheet of stars stretched tight across the darkness, and a crescent moon hung low like a curved blade. The pines swayed gently, but the air itself was unnervingly still. I remember pausing near the midpoint of the ridge, where the terrain narrows and the path dips slightly between 2 thick trunks. That was where it had happened before, where the knocks seemed to echo, where the breathing had circled me like a predator testing the fence of a cage. But that night, there was nothing at first, just the familiar scent of pine pitch and cold soil. I felt almost relieved. Maybe whatever I'd heard had moved on. Maybe it had been some strange acoustic phenomenon, a trick of wind and terrain. My shoulders loosened. I exhaled long and slow, letting the tension drain from my neck. It was the first moment of ease I'd felt since the encounter. And that was when I smelled it. A sour, musky odor drifting through the air, heavy enough to coat the back of my throat. Not the scent of any animal I recognized. Not bear, not elk, not cougar. It was sharper, more primal, like damp earth mixed with something decaying. Something that shouldn't have been airborne at all. I froze, listening for movement, scanning the slope with my flashlight. The beam cut across the trees, revealing nothing but bark and snow-dusted branches. Then the knocking began again. 2 heavy knocks. Thud. Thud. Not from the ridge this time. From behind me. My body reacted before my mind could form words. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight across the trail. The beam jerked over roots and stones, illuminating only the tight corridor of trees stretching down toward the valley. But the sound hadn't been distant. It had been close. Too close. A prickling sensation crawled up my arms as the smell grew stronger. I tried to steady my breathing, but each inhale felt like drawing in rot. Something moved beyond the circle of light, a soft crunch of frost under weight, followed by the creak of a branch. Not snapping, not breaking, just a subtle shift, controlled, intentional. That was when instinct, the pure, unfiltered instinct that comes from the animal part of the brain, told me I was not alone. And whatever stood out there didn't want to stay hidden anymore. The knocks came again, louder this time. Thud, thud. I raised my radio, but before I could press the button, a low rumble vibrated through the ground. Not an earthquake, not machinery. This was different, rhythmic. Like something enormous, shifting its weight deeper in the forest. The flashlight trembled in my hand, scattering the beam across the trail. Then from the darkness, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any human throat, or any animal's either. A long guttural exhale followed by a rasping growl that made every hair on my body rise at once. I stepped backwards slowly. 1 step. 2. 3. My boots slid slightly in the frost, but I kept my balance. I wanted to run. Every part of me screamed to run. But training and instinct fought inside my chest, wrestling for control. Running triggers pursuit. Running means your prey. So I forced myself to breathe, to move gradually, to keep the beam steady, even though my hands shook with a tremor that felt deeper than fear. It felt like recognition. The smell thickened until it felt like a physical thing pressing against me. My lungs ached with each inhale. The growl faded into a low, throaty hum, almost like the beginning of speech. The sound rippled through the trees, bouncing off trunks and echoing in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. Then the forest went silent. Not the quiet of a calm night. Not the hush of snow. A dead silence. No wind, no creaking branches, no distant birds, no rustling underbrush. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat. It felt swallowed by the stillness. The silence pressed against my ears, so complete that for a moment I wondered if I had gone deaf. I lifted my flashlight again. That was when I saw them. 2 massive shapes moving between the trees, tall enough that their heads nearly reached the lower branches. They didn't walk like animals. They swayed slightly, as though adjusting to the weight of their own bodies. Their silhouettes were dense, hulking, and disturbingly human-like, if a human had been stretched, swollen, and covered in thick layers of hair. I blinked hard, convincing myself my eyes were playing tricks in the low light, but they didn't disappear. They stood there, unmoving, just beyond the beam's reach. Watching me. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel their attention, a heavy, suffocating awareness that made my breath hitch in my throat. My radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence with a burst of static. The noise echoed like an explosion in the quiet, and the 2 shapes jerked their heads in my direction with a speed that didn't feel natural. I fumbled with the device, nearly dropping it before managing to silence it. When I looked up again, the shapes were gone, not retreated, not stepped away, just gone, as if the darkness had swallowed them. The smell vanished with them. The silence remained. I stood frozen for a long moment, my mind spiraling between explanations. Maybe they were shadows, tricks of light, trees moving in the wind, but I had seen them clearly enough to know those were lies my fear wanted me to accept. My denial clawed for anything that would make the moment feel less real. But real doesn't wait for permission. A sharp snap echoed behind me, loud, close, unmistakable. A large branch breaking under weight. This time, I didn't look. I couldn't. I felt the presence behind me like a burning pressure on my spine, and I knew if I turned around, I might not make it back. So I did the one thing every ranger is taught never to do. I ran. My boots pounded the trail, slipping, scraping, jarring my ankles as I sprinted downhill. The cold air tore through my lungs. The trees blurred past in streaks of black and gray. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My body moved on sheer survival instinct, every muscle burning with adrenaline. The forest around me seemed to shift. The path felt narrower, the ground steeper, as though the woods were trying to hold me in place. Halfway down, I heard something following. Heavy. Fast. closer than I wanted to believe. Branches snapped. Earth thudded. Something large moving through the trees with terrifying momentum. I pushed harder, almost tumbling as the trail curved, the outpost lights flickering faintly far below. I fixated on them, on their warmth, on the promise of walls and locks and distance. My lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The thudding behind me grew louder. Then, just as I reached the final slope, everything went silent again. Completely silent. I didn't question the gift. I didn't slow down. I barreled through the last stretch and stumbled into the snow beside the outpost steps, gasping, trembling, clutching the earth like it was the only solid thing left. When I finally stood and looked back toward the ridge, the forest was still, peaceful, as if nothing had been there at all. But something had been, something that moved without leaving tracks, something that breathed like a furnace, something that watched me with a patience that felt colder than the weather. And that night, as I locked the outpost door behind me, I realized something unsettling. Whatever lived in those woods hadn't chased me to kill me. It had chased me to warn me. I barely slept for 3 nights after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the knocks again. Deep, deliberate, patient. I kept replaying the shadows I'd seen on the ridge, the smell that clung to the air, the weight of something watching me in the darkness. But what unsettled me most wasn't fear. It was the sense that the forest had chosen to reveal something to me. As if after years of patrolling these trails, I had finally crossed into a part of its memory I wasn't meant to see. I tried convincing myself that I had exaggerated it in my mind, that stress and cold and exhaustion had shaped the shadows into monsters, that adrenaline had distorted distance and motion, that my senses had betrayed me. Denial can be a comforting place. You cling to it like a blanket, convincing yourself that fear has no authority unless you acknowledge it. But the forest doesn't bend to denial. It doesn't care what you believe. On the 4th morning, when I finally forced myself to step outside again, I saw tracks in the frost behind the outpost. Not footprints. Not paw prints either. They were indentations, wide, deep, roughly oval, and spaced far too far apart for any human stride. The prints circled the building once, then vanished into the trees. No trail leading in. No trail leading out. Just a perfect ring around where I slept. That's when I knew the encounter on the ridge hadn't been random. It had followed me. And worse, it had come close enough to watch me sleep. I reported it to my supervisor, carefully, cautiously, using enough logic to avoid sounding unhinged. I described the knocks as unknown percussive sounds, the smell as likely a dead animal, the silhouettes as large fauna, possibly a bear, the tracks as unusual frost depressions. He nodded politely as I spoke, but his eyes told me everything. He had heard this before. Maybe not from me, but from someone. He didn't say he believed me. He didn't say I was imagining things. He just said, stay cautious, and changed the subject. That was the first sign something deeper was at play. The second sign came from the locals. People in the town had always been friendly in that quiet, tight-knit way small communities are. But after my encounter, their tone changed. The woman at the bait shop asked if I'd been up there after moonrise. A hunter in the aisle beside me muttered something about the North Ridge stirring again. The old logger at the diner, the one who once hid in the hollow stump, gave me a long, heavy stare before saying, "You should have kept your distance. Sometimes the forest warns you before it feeds." I tried asking questions, but they all dodged, deflected, or fell silent. Nobody wanted to be the one to tell the ranger what he wasn't supposed to know, but I needed answers. So I kept listening, watching, and one night I got the first real piece of information, though I didn't know it at the time. It was close to midnight, and I was driving the service road back toward the outpost when I noticed a truck pulled onto the shoulder. Its headlights were off, and the windows were down despite the cold. And in the driver's seat sat a man I had seen a few times around town, a retired trapper who lived in a cabin farther up the road. His name didn't matter much. What mattered was the look on his face. He was staring into the trees across the road as if they were speaking to him. I slowed my vehicle and rolled the window down. "You all right?" I asked. He didn't answer at first. His eyes didn't even flicker toward me. He just kept staring into that wall of darkness, breathing slow and steady like he was bracing himself for something. Then he spoke. "They're changing again," he whispered. I frowned. "Who's changing?" He exhaled shakily and his breath fogged in the cold. "The forest spirits," he murmured. "That's what my grandfather called them. Spirits of the pines. Guardians, if you ask the old folks. Monsters, if you ask the rest. They're not supposed to come close, not unless something's wrong." My pulse quickened. Something wrong like what? He turned then, slowly, as if it pained him. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression bleak with the kind of fear that's lived in someone's bones for decades, like someone waking them up. The words hit me harder than the knocks ever had. I asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. Instead, he started his truck, pulled back onto the road, and drove off without another word. His taillights faded into the darkness until I was alone again, listening to the forest breathe. I knew I should have driven straight back to the outpost, but something compelled me. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, maybe a pull I didn't recognize yet. So I shut off my lights, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked toward the tree line. The night felt unnaturally warm, despite the frost on the ground. A faint breeze brushed past me, carrying the scent of pine resin and something else, something metallic, like old blood. I scanned the forest, waiting for the shapes to appear again, but the darkness held still. Then I heard it. A low hum. Soft at first, almost like wind passing through a hollow trunk. But as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was rhythmic, layered, pulsing in a strange cadence that felt too organized, too intentional. The sound drifted between the trees, vibrating faintly in the soil. It reminded me of the hum I'd heard when those two shapes had appeared on the ridge. A chill rippled up my spine. I lifted my flashlight and stepped forward, and immediately the humming stopped. Not faded, stopped, as if cut off mid-breath. Then everything went silent again, the same dead silence as before. No insects, no rustling, not even the faint hum of distant wind, the kind of silence that feels like the world is pausing to watch you. I swallowed hard and lowered the beam, taking slow steps backward. My instinct screamed at me to retreat, but there was something else, a whisper at the edge of consciousness, a prickling tug just beneath thought. Then the knocking returned. Not ahead of me, not behind me, all around me. A perfect circle of knocks echoing through the trees in unison. Thud, 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 thud. 4 knocks, evenly spaced. Like a ritual, like a signal, like a warning delivered in the forest's native tongue. The air grew heavy, pressing against my lungs. I tried to move, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The knocks grew louder, echoing deeper, vibrating through the soil under my boots. And then the smell hit me. Not rot this time, something older. Earthier, like damp fur and crushed needles and ancient soil disturbed after a century of stillness. I forced myself to turn. That was when I saw it. Not the two shapes from the ridge. Something else. Something standing farther back, deeper in the dark, nearly 20 feet tall if it was an inch. Its silhouette rippled, its outline shifting as if the darkness wrapped it around it like a living cloak. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it, a cold, ancient intelligence staring straight into me. My breath hitched. It raised an arm, slow and deliberate, until its massive hand hovered just above a tree trunk. Then it knocked. Once. Thud. The sound nearly buckled my knees, not because it was loud, but because I felt it, not just in my ears, but in my chest, my bones, my heartbeat, as if it was knocking inside me. The tree behind it shuddered, shedding frost. I stumbled back, unable to breathe. The giant lowered its arm, and then, without warning, it stepped backward. 1 stride, 2, 3, and melted into the darkness like smoke. The other knocks stopped instantly. The silence pressed in again. That was when I realized something else, something worse than seeing that towering shape or hearing the ritualistic knocking. A fresh set of tracks in the frost led toward the outpost. My outpost. They were newly formed, deep as craters, heading straight for the place where I slept. Straight for me. I followed those tracks only long enough to understand their direction. They cut clean lines through the frost, each one deep enough to pool with the faintest sheen of melting ice, almost as though whatever made them radiated heat. They weren't frantic or hurried. They were deliberate, spaced with the precision of something that walked without fear of anything in this world. I shined my flashlight down the slope and saw the indentation pattern fade into shadow, pointing unmistakably toward the outpost, toward the small wooden building that, up until that moment, I had foolishly assumed could protect me. A part of me wanted to keep following the tracks, to confront whatever had stood there, to demand answers in the same way a child demands monsters reveal themselves so the fear will go away. But another part, the deeper, older part of instinct, told me that if I kept walking, I might never come back. So I turned and headed toward the outpost, each step shaky, each inhale tight in my chest. The night around me felt like a living thing, breathing in sync with my nerves, watching with the patience of something ancient and curious. My flashlight flickered twice on the way down. Not from dying batteries, I had replaced them that afternoon. It flickered like something brushed the light from the air. By the time I reached the outpost, a thin layer of fog had pooled around the building's foundation. It smelled faintly of pine sap and cold stone. Nothing alarming, but enough to remind me that nothing was normal tonight. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and shut it behind me, pressing my back against the wood as though my weight could keep the night out. That was when I heard it. A knock. Not a loud one, not a warning, a soft, almost polite tap on the door behind me. I didn't breathe, not at first. My pulse hammered so hard my vision blurred for a moment. I turned slowly, staring at the door, half expecting claws or a shadow to press against the window pane. But nothing moved. The fog outside curled against the porch like a sleeping animal. The pines swayed with a calmness that made the knock feel even more unnatural. I lifted a trembling hand toward the latch, then stopped myself. Opening that door would be the most reckless thing I could do. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the wood, waiting for another sound. Instead, something else changed. The temperature inside the outpost dropped sharply, my breath fogged in front of me, hanging heavy in the air. The wood walls creaked, not from settling, but from pressure, like something outside was leaning its weight against the building in slow, testing intervals. I stepped away from the door and reached for my radio, but a crackle of static hissed through the speaker before I even pressed the button. Then from somewhere in the static, a faint hum rose. Familiar, rhythmic, the same hum I'd heard in the forest. I set the radio down and backed toward the window, lifting the flashlight to shine outside. The beam caught the fog and dissolved instantly. I angled it higher. That was when a shape appeared in the distance. Tall, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out its features. It was too far, but the outline was unmistakable, the same towering figure I had seen earlier. It stood just beyond the fog line, head bowed slightly, as though studying the outpost like a puzzle it intended to solve. For a long moment, neither of us moved, then it raised its arm again. Even from that distance, I saw the motion clearly, the slow lift, the bend at the elbow, the massive fingers curling into a fist, and then it knocked on a tree beside it. One single, thunderous knock that echoed across the clearing. Thud. The ground vibrated beneath my boots. The outpost walls groaned. The trees behind it rustled violently, shedding frost like feathers. But the worst part wasn't the sound. It was the answer that came from behind the outpost. Another knock. Deep, distant, but unmistakably replying. Then another from farther up the ridge, then another from across the valley. Within seconds, the forest around the outpost resounded with knocks, dozens of them, each one spaced at irregular distances, each one answering the first in a call and response rhythm older than language. The knocks rolled through the trees, overlapping, weaving into a pattern I couldn't decipher, but instinctively understood. They weren't communicating with me. They were communicating with each other. I stumbled backward and hit the desk behind me. Papers slid to the floor. My flashlight flickered again, then died completely. The only light came from the moon outside, dim and cold, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The knocking grew faster, louder. The forest pulsed with it. For a moment, I thought the outpost itself might be lifted from its foundation. I gripped the edge of the desk, feeling the tremors through the wood. It wasn't just the giants knocking anymore. It was smaller creatures too, sticks snapping, branches shaking, trees responding as though the entire forest had been drawn into the ritual. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. No wind, no knocks, no hum, no movement, only silence. A silence so thick I could hear the faint ringing in my ears. I leaned forward, trying to catch my breath, when something tapped the window. Soft, delicate, almost gentle. I snapped my head toward it. A handprint, massive, far larger than any human, pressed against the glass from outside. The fingers were long, tapered, almost elegant, and they smeared frost as they moved. Not clawed, not gnarled, just otherworldly. The hand slid downward slowly, leaving a streak of cold that fogged the window further. Then the hand withdrew, and the forest exhaled. Not with breath, with stillness. The fog retreated, the cold lifted, the presence faded. I didn't move for several minutes. Couldn't. My mind had reached a place beyond fear, a place of hollow, suspended disbelief where the world stops making sense but keeps moving anyway. When my legs finally stopped trembling, I stepped outside the outpost, keeping my flashlight off. The moonlight illuminated the clearing faintly, and there, just 10 feet from the door, stood a single track. Fresh, deep, melting frost pooling in the impression. I knelt beside it. It was easily 20 inches long. Beside it, almost perfectly aligned, was another track. Smaller, narrower, still large, but not the giant I had seen. And something about that second track hit me harder than the shadows, the knocks, or the towering figure. It resembled a human foot, elongated, distorted, but unmistakably human. My chest tightened. That was when I realized the truth, a truth the locals had tried to avoid telling me, a truth that had been circling me like a wolf waiting for a stumble. These things weren't just spirits. They weren't just guardians. They weren't just watchers. They were remnants of something older, of something that used to be human, something that lived here before us, something the forest kept, the way a cave keeps echoes long after a scream, something that had been asleep, that we woke up. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of that understanding settle over me like snowfall. The pines around me creaked softly, as if acknowledging my realization. Not in approval, not in warning, in recognition, because the forest had chosen me not as prey, but as witness. And that was the part that terrified me most. For the first time in my life, I understood why the locals whispered, why they locked their doors at sunset, why they refused to tell the full story. It wasn't to protect the legend. It was to protect the listener. Because once you understand what walks among the pines, you can't unhear the knocks, you can't unfeel the silence, and you can't unknow the truth. The forest remembers everything, and now it remembers you. I looked into the darkness one last time, feeling the weight of countless stories behind me and countless more ahead. My breath hitched with a blend of fear and awe, an emotion I couldn't separate anymore. I wasn't just a ranger. I wasn't just a protector. I was part of the memory now, a thread in the pine's long whispering history, a witness to the things that used to be human, a keeper of the warnings carved not in words but in knocks. And as I stepped back inside the outpost, closing the door gently behind me, I felt the forest settle into stillness again, a stillness that wasn't peace but understanding. The pines whispered their approval, or their claim. And for the first time, I whispered back, not out of fear, but reverence. I hear you. And the forest answered with silence, a silence I carry with me still, a silence that teaches me caution, humility, and the hardest lesson of all, not everything in the dark wants to harm you. Some things simply want to be remembered. And out here in the deep spine of the northern wilderness, the remembering never ends. The night the pines first whispered my name, I thought it was only the wind, until the wind stopped and the voice didn't. My name is, well, most folks just call me Ridge, but names don't mean much out here. Not when the forest has a way of stripping you down to the bones of who you truly are. I'm 42 years old, and I've worked these mountains long enough to know the difference between the creak of a tree in the frost and the sound of something living, breathing, thinking. I've spent the better part of my life as a ranger in the northern Montana backcountry, where the ridgelines fold into one another like weather-worn pages, and the locals talk about the woods the same way they talk about church, softly, reverently, like something might hear. I used to think the stories were exaggerations, old-timers spinning tales about spirits in the tree line, shapes moving where the moonlight bends wrong. I thought fear was just something you learned to manage with experience. Then the forest gave me its first warning. It was late September, the season I've always liked best, when the air gets thin enough to sting your lungs and the pines stand still as sentinels. I had been out checking trail cameras after a string of odd reports from hikers, distant knocking at night, stones being stacked in strange formations, and shadows hanging heavier than they should. The kind of vague, uneasy details you write off if you're not the one walking alone beneath the starless canopy. I remember the crunch of frost under my boots and the way the cold seemed to climb right through the fabric of my jacket. A smell lingered in the air, sap, wet bark, and something else. Something metallic, faint, like the breath of an animal that had been running too hard for too long. I shrugged it off. Fear, I told myself, is a creature you feed with attention. But the feeling stayed. It pressed against the back of my neck, nudged at my ribs, tightened around every breath. I reached the first camera, aimed at a narrow game corridor. The screen flickered. Dead battery. Odd. I'd replaced them only days before. I checked the second camera farther up the slope. Same thing. The third, missing. The fourth smashed clean in half. Not clawed, not chewed, crushed as if by a hand far stronger than any upright creature in these woods should have possessed. That was when I heard it. The knock. 3 short raps. Hollow. Wooden. At first, I thought it was a fellow ranger messing with me, but there were no other patrols scheduled that night, and anyway, the sound came from deep among the trees, far from any logical human path. It echoed once, then again, then stopped abruptly, the way an enormous creature might halt mid-breath if it realized it had been heard. My stomach tightened. Something inside me, something older than logic, whispered run. I forced a slow inhale instead. Rangers don't run from noise. That's what I used to tell rookies. Don't run from the noise. Investigate. Understand. But every instinct in me recoiled. The forest had gone silent. No wind, no crickets, no owls. Even the branches, normally restless with squirrels, sat unmoving. My breath sounded too loud, like it was announcing me. Then another knock. Closer. I swept my flashlight through the pines. Nothing moved, but the light caught on something high up in the branches. Fur? No. Moss? No, it was pale. Like the bend of a wrist, I blinked and it vanished. A shape shifted between 2 trunks 30 yards ahead. Tall. Wrong. A silhouette that seemed to breathe with the tree line, merging with it, dissolving, then reappearing where I wasn't expecting it to be. I told myself it was a trick of the dark. I told myself the cold messes with depth perception. I told myself a lot of reasonable things because the truth would have broken me. I radioed the station, but all I got was static. A heavy, rolling static that vibrated in my teeth. I stepped backward, slow, careful, as the smell in the air grew sharper, metal, wet soil, an animal musk that carried a strange undertone of decay. Then something knocked directly behind me, so close I felt the vibration in my ribs. I spun. No one. Nothing. Only a pine trunk thicker than my body, the bark scarred with old lightning burns. But the knock had come from it. Too deliberate, too structured. Not an animal. Not nature. Something had used the tree like a door. A warning? A greeting? A threat? I didn't wait to find out. I walked back to the trail out fast, but controlled. My pulse hammered. The forest pressed in, the pines crowding closer, their branches angling inward as if bowing, listening. By the time I reached the service road, my breath had frosted into a thin fog that hung around me like ghostly fabric. I got into my truck, shut the door, and locked it, something I had never done before on patrol. The knocking didn't follow, but the silence did. When I returned to the station, the old chief, Murphy, looked at me with a frown. He was the kind of man who could read a room by smell alone. He asked what I saw. I told him nothing, but he studied me the way someone studies a wound they know isn't on the surface. Finally, he nodded toward the window overlooking the pines. "You heard it, didn't you?" He said it like a fact. Not a question, not an accusation, just a quiet statement of truth. When I didn't answer, he just nodded again and muttered words I'd only heard from locals, never from another ranger. "Then the forest has chosen you." I didn't understand what he meant. I wish now that I'd asked, because in that moment, before the true horrors came, before I learned what lives deeper than roots, I still believed fear was just another hazard of the job, like snowblindness or dehydration, something manageable. I didn't know the forest had a memory. I didn't know it held grudges. I didn't know it could want something from me. That night was only the beginning. The first time the woods tried to speak. The first time I felt the line between reality and something else, something older, begin to thin, and I wasn't ready to hear what came next. I wasn't ready, but the forest didn't care about readiness. It never has. It only cares that you listen. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale shape nestled between the branches, too smooth to be bark, too still to be an animal. I told myself it was just shock, that I'd worked too many back-to-back shifts. That exhaustion makes the mind twist shadows into threats. But denial only keeps you safe until the woods find a way to remind you that they don't bend to your comfort. The reminder came 3 nights later. I was covering a late shift alone again, patrolling an old logging road deeper in the interior. The locals call the area Red Hollow, not because the soil is red, though it is, but because of an older legend. The kind that isn't told loudly. The kind that makes people look over their shoulders before finishing the sentence. I'd forgotten the details of that legend until that night. But as soon as I passed the rusted trail marker nailed into a leaning pine, something in the air changed. It was warmer than it should have been for October. Too warm. The kind of heat that clings to your skin like wet breath. And the silence. God, the silence felt almost swollen. I remember thinking of a lung inhaling deeply, trapping the air, waiting to exhale. I stepped out of the truck to inspect an abandoned campsite someone had reported earlier. Just a tent, torn down the center. Sleeping bags shredded. Food left untouched. No blood, no drag marks. Just a sense that whoever had been there left in a hurry, without looking back. I tried to convince myself it was a bear. But bears don't unzip tents, and this one was unzipped. Clean, smooth, like a hand had done it. I crouched to examine it when I heard the whistle. Not a bird. Not a person. Something else. It came from the ridge to my left, high, sustained, like someone blowing across a bottle's mouth, but adding a tremor at the end. I stood up slowly. The sound faded, then returned. Closer. A bead of sweat slid down my spine. Whistling is rare out here. The wind can mimic it, but only when it snakes through canyons or tight rock formations. This whistle was deliberate. It had rhythm, intention. I took one step back toward my truck, and the whistle stopped abruptly. Then, from the opposite direction, a different sound rose. A low, heavy exhale, almost a grunt. A big animal, maybe. Mountain lion? No, too deep, too slow. A bear? Too calm. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Then behind me, snap. A twig. Something heavy had stepped on it. My breath stuttered. I kept my flashlight pointed steady, though my hand was trembling hard enough to blur the beam. I turned in a slow circle, the light cutting slices through the dark. It wasn't enough. The trees were too dense, the shadows too thick. The forest felt alive, like it had leaned in to watch. Another exhale. Closer now. The scent hit next, musky, earthy, but layered with something else. Something sour. Fear has a smell, and this was it. Not mine. Something else's. Something breathing heavy, fast, ragged. I backed toward my truck, my boots crunching against the leaves, and just as I touched the handle, the whistle came again, this time from directly above me. I jerked the flashlight skyward. There, perched in the crook of two massive branches, was a shape, tall, bent, clutching the trunk with fingers too long, too pale, too still. Its eyes reflected the light, not like an animal's with the typical shine, but with a dull, muted gleam like polished river stones, unmoving, watching. I froze. My lungs forgot how to work. For a second, we stared at each other. Me on the ground, it suspended between branches as though the tree had grown a human limb. Then it moved. Not down, not away, but sideways, along the trunk. No creature moves like that. No human I've ever seen can cling to bark without shifting weight or slipping. But this thing did. Effortless. Silent. The forest seemed to pull back like it didn't want to be too close. I didn't run. I launched backward into the truck, slammed the door, locked it, and turned the engine. Gravel shot behind me as I sped down the road, my heart rattling against my ribs so hard I tasted blood. I looked in the rearview mirror only once. It was enough. The thing stood now in the middle of the road where I'd been seconds before, tall, slender, shoulders crooked at angles no joint should allow. It didn't chase. It didn't move. It only watched as I fled. I drove until the station lights appeared through the trees. Only then did I stop shaking. Murphy was waiting for me again, leaning against the doorframe with that same tight-lipped expression. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He only said, "You went into Red Hollow, didn't you?" I tried to deflect, tried to make it seem like nothing unusual had happened, tried to rationalize a creature that moved sideways along bark. But he wasn't having it. He stepped closer, lowered his voice. "Ridge, there are places you don't go alone. Not at night. Not even in daylight, if you can help it. Red Hollow is one of them." I asked him why. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old newspaper clipping, faded, yellowed, brittle. It showed a group of men in flannel, their faces pale, standing near a crude stone marker. The headline read, "Logging Crew Abandons Site After Strange Incidents." 1952. I skimmed the text, my heartbeat thudding louder with each sentence. Unexplained knocking, whistling calls, shadows described as too tall, too thin, 3 men missing, tools found stacked neatly on stumps. Murphy took the clipping back and returned it to the drawer. "That hollow," he said quietly, "isn't empty. It never has been." I asked him if he'd seen the creature, the figure, the thing in the tree. His jaw tightened. Not the same one, but something like it. I wanted him to say more. Tell me what it was. Give me a name so the fear could be contained. But he only shook his head and poured himself a coffee, his hand trembling just slightly. "You need rest, Ridge. Tomorrow, stay near the lower trails. Stay out of the interior." But orders like that are easier given than followed. Curiosity is a sickness when you work in the woods. The forest shows you something impossible, and some part of you, some reckless human part, needs to understand. I didn't want to return to Red Hollow, but I knew I would, eventually. Even then, I felt the pull. But before that return, before the truth of what lived out there revealed itself, the forest had one more story to tell me, one that began with footprints that didn't match any creature known to science, one that made me question whether I belonged out here at all. One that made me wonder if the pines whisper because they're trying to warn us, or because they're speaking to something else entirely. That question haunted me more than any shadow or whistle ever could. It clung to my thoughts during patrols, slipped into my dreams, and waited for me each morning like a second heartbeat. The forest had chosen me, Murphy's words, and I didn't yet know whether that meant it wanted to show me something or swallow me whole. The next encounter came during a rescue call. It was midday. Bright, cold, and deceptively peaceful. A family of 3 had reported hearing strange cries near the northern ridges, sounds too deep to be elk and too rhythmic to be wolves. They'd left the area fast, but said they saw what looked like footprints in the snow, unlike anything they'd ever encountered. Footprints always get our attention, especially when they come with fear behind them. I radioed in my plan, geared up, and started the ascent toward Ridge 8. The snow was fresh, untouched except for a single winding trail of prints. At first glance, they looked almost humanoid, elongated, wide, with clear impressions of toes. But the stride was wrong. Too long. Too deliberate. And some prints twisted sideways as though whatever made them could pivot its feet without shifting its weight. A familiar tightness wrapped around my ribs. I followed them upward, checking the surrounding trees, alert for anything that moved wrong, breathed wrong, existed wrong. The air had a bite to it, not just cold, but sharp, metallic, almost electric. It made the hairs on my arms stand up, even under layers of fleece. As I climbed, the prints grew fresher, edges crisp, snow not yet glazed by the wind. Whoever or whatever made them wasn't far. And then the smell hit me. Not musk this time. Not decay. Something else. Something like iron filings and wet stone. Something that didn't belong in the biology of any creature native to the Rockies. I slowed. My breath fogged in front of me, hanging motionless in the air as if the forest refused to carry it away. Up ahead, just inside a cluster of not bent pines, something moved. A silhouette. Upright. For a second, my mind chose the safest option. Human. Maybe a lost hiker. Maybe someone injured. But I knew better. Humans don't stand that tall, or hunched in a way that suggests their shoulders aren't aligned like ours, or sway like something studying you from behind a veil of branches. I raised my voice slowly, calmly, the way we're trained. Hey, if you can hear me, I'm a ranger. I can help. Just stay where you are. The shape didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. Didn't tilt its head or shift its weight or do anything a person would instinctively do upon hearing another human presence. I took one cautious step closer, and it stepped back, impossibly fluid, slipping behind a tree without a sound, as if the snow didn't exist beneath its feet. I followed. I shouldn't have. The prints led straight into the thicket. I ducked under low branches, brushing aside needles heavy with frost. The forest felt tighter here, more deliberate in its spacing, like the trees had arranged themselves to funnel me in. The wind died completely. No birds, no insects, not even the faint creak of swaying trunks. Just silence, and then another sound. Not a whistle, not a knock, a hum. Low, vibrating like the rumble of a distant engine, but too organic, too warm. It pulsed against my chest, syncing with my heartbeat until the two rhythms felt indistinguishable. I froze. The hum intensified. The trees around me trembled, not from wind, but from resonance, as though something beneath the forest was waking, stretching, breathing in long, slow pulses. I stepped back, onto a patch of snow so soft it gave way immediately. The ground dropped beneath me. For a moment, I was suspended in cold, empty air. Then I crashed downward into darkness, landing hard on a packed bed of pine needles hidden under the snow. Pain shot up my spine. I groaned, pushing myself upright. My flashlight clattered to the ground, spinning, its beam slicing across rough cavern walls. A cavern. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a natural sinkhole. It was too even, too intentional. The walls were lined with claw marks. No, not claw marks. More like grooves, long sweeping arcs etched into the stone as though something enormous had dragged its hands across the rock, tracing paths with careful pressure. The hum was louder here, more focused. I felt it in my teeth. Then I heard breathing. Heavy, wet, measured, not mine. I swung the flashlight's beam toward the sound. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw eyes, not glowing, not animalistic, just eyes, black, depthless, reflecting the light the way obsidian might. They blinked once. I stumbled back, my boots scraping dirt as the figure leaned into the beam. Its skin, or what passed for skin, was pale, almost luminescent, stretched taut over a frame too tall to be human. Shoulders peaked sharply. Arms hung longer than they should. And its mouth looked human, except for the width. Except for the way it didn't quite close, like it was listening through the split of its lips. The hum wasn't coming from it. It was breathing in time with it. My blood iced. I whispered because my voice wouldn't rise. "What are you?" The eyes did not blink again. The hum swelled, vibrating the cavern walls, shaking loose small stones from above. The creature tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, like a child regarding a new toy. Then it moved. Fast. Too fast, but not toward me. It scrambled upward along the cavern wall, using its impossibly long limbs to scale the rock in seconds, reaching the rim of the sinkhole with an unnatural, horrifying grace. For a moment, its silhouette framed itself against the gray sky, tall, twisted, elongated. Then it vanished into the trees. I was alone with the hum. I forced myself to climb out using the vines and roots exposed by erosion. My hands scraped raw against the stone. My lungs burned. Every second felt like an hour. When I finally hauled myself over the edge, the silence hit again. Total, suffocating, absolute. No hum, no breathing, no movement. But the footprints were gone, completely erased, wiped from the snow cleanly as if someone had dragged a giant brush across the surface, or as if the forest itself had swallowed them. I stumbled back to the trail, heart hammering, adrenaline shaking my limbs. I radioed in, but my voice didn't sound like mine. Too thin, too strained. When I returned to the station, Murphy didn't greet me this time. He didn't ask questions. He just stared for a long, heavy moment, then closed the blinds, something I'd never seen him do in daylight. He poured 2 coffees, his hands shaking worse than before. "Ridge," he said quietly. His voice cracked. "This place doesn't show itself to just anyone." I asked him again, "What is it?" He didn't answer directly. He never did. Instead, he said, "The locals talk about spirits. Some talk about giants. Others talk about shadows that learn to walk. But the truth is, no one knows. Not the tribe elders, not the loggers, not the rangers who lasted longer than they should have." His eyes lifted to mine. "What I do know is this: once you hear them, really hear them, the forest never lets you go back to being who you were." I didn't sleep that night either, because he was right. Something in me had changed. The forest wasn't just a place anymore, it was a presence. And I knew it was waiting for me, watching, preparing, because the next story, the one the forest forced on me, would shake whatever was left of my certainty, my strength, my sanity. The next story began with a scream, a human scream. And it didn't come from the woods, it came from inside the station. A scream, raw, tearing, filled with something far beyond fear. Murphy and I locked eyes for half a second before he bolted toward the hallway. My body reacted before thought caught up. We ran. The scream cut off abruptly, like someone had pressed a mute button on reality. The silence that followed was worse. We reached the supply room at the far end of the building. Door open, fluorescent light flickering violently, scattering shadows across the walls in sharp, panicked stutters. No one was inside, but the room felt occupied. The air was thick, almost tactile, as if something invisible was pressing against the walls, pushing outward, testing the strength of the structure. My throat tightened as a faint vibration entered my bones, the same hum from the cavern, only thinner, more thread-like, as if stretched across the room like invisible wire. Murphy stepped forward slowly. His breath was shaking. He whispered my name, barely audible, but before I could answer, something behind the shelves shifted with a soft, sliding sound. We both froze, another shift. Then a shape leaned into view. Not the creature from the cavern, not that tall, not that unnatural. This one was human. A ranger. Connell. Young. 8 months into the job. Strong. Level-headed. A guy who used to hum classic rock under his breath during long shifts because he claimed it kept the woods from getting any ideas. Now he stood rigid in front of us, eyes wide, pupils blown open so large the irises were barely visible. His chest heaved in short, panicked bursts. His lips trembled, but no sound came. Murphy approached cautiously. "Connell, talk to me." Connell shook his head in tiny, frantic motions. Murphy lifted a hand slowly and reached toward his shoulder, and Connell flinched so violently he slammed against the shelf behind him. A metal canister clattered to the floor, the echo bouncing unnaturally as if the room were larger than it was. He pressed himself into the corner, trembling. Tears streamed down his face silently, cutting pale lines through the dirt smeared across his cheeks. Murphy whispered, "What happened?" Connell's jaw opened, but instead of words, a low whine escaped. It was animalistic, broken, a sound someone makes when the mind can't shape what the eyes have seen. Finally, through choked breaths, he managed one sentence. "It followed me home. Murphy's hand dropped. My blood went cold. Connell's voice splintered as he continued. I locked my doors. I closed my blinds. I left every light on. And it still found a way inside. He pressed his palms to his temples. His fingers dug into his scalp like he was trying to hold his skull together. It didn't open the door. It didn't break a window. It just appeared. Murphy's voice was gentle, trembling. What did? Connell's eyes snapped up, and the look in them made my legs weaken. The one from the trees. His voice fractured into a whisper, the one that whispers back. I felt something deep in my chest twist, a knot pulling tighter, squeezing the air from my lungs because I knew exactly what he meant. The cavern creature, or something like it. Something tied to the hum, the footprints, the impossible movement of shadows among branches. Before either of us could speak, a new sound filled the room. Knocking. 3 sharp raps, but it wasn't coming from the door. It came from the wall behind Connell. He screamed again, shorter this time, more of a strangled gasp, and stumbled forward. Murphy reached him first, grabbing his arm, steadying him. The knocking repeated, 3 more raps, louder, closer. My flashlight flickered. Connell shook uncontrollably. It called my name. Murphy's face went white, and then the station lights went out. Pitch black swallowed us whole. The knocking intensified, becoming rapid, frantic, like dozens of fists pounding from within the walls. I felt the vibrations through the floorboards, through my bones, through the deepest parts of me that I never wanted touched. Then one final knock, right beside my ear. I spun, swinging the flashlight wildly. The beam flickered, sputtered, caught briefly on the wall, and for the shortest moment I saw an impression forming in the wood. A handprint. Long fingers. Too long. Something was trying to push through. Murphy grabbed my shoulder. Move! Now! We dragged Connell down the hallway blind, except for my dying flashlight. The walls groaned. The building creaked under some unseen pressure from outside, from above, from below. I couldn't tell. The direction of danger blurred into every angle. We reached the exit. I shoved the door open. Cold air crashed over us like a wave. But the pines were swaying, though there was no wind. Their trunks bent subtly like they were bowing or listening. Murphy yelled for us to run to the trucks. Connell didn't move. He turned toward the tree line, slow, as if pulled by invisible threads, and whispered something I'll never forget. It's calling again. His voice was calm. Too calm. Murphy tried to grab him, but Connell slipped from his grasp like water. He walked toward the trees with an unsettling steadiness, his boots crunching lightly in the frost, his posture relaxed, as though approaching an old friend. I shouted his name. He didn't look back. The forest seemed to exhale as he crossed the boundary of the lot, branches shifting, needles trembling, the earth humming faintly beneath our feet. Then, just beyond the first row of pines, something moved. Tall, thin, bent. Exactly like the creature I had seen climbing from the cavern, it stepped out, only partially illuminated by the beam of my dying flashlight. One elongated arm reached toward Connell, not quickly, not aggressively, almost welcoming. Connell reached back. Murphy screamed at him. I did too. Our voices broke the air, shattered against the trees, but the forest swallowed them before they could reach him, and in a matter of seconds, Connell was gone, not pulled, not dragged, just gone. Swallowed by the dark between the pines, Murphy fell to his knees, hands buried in his hair, whispering curses, prayers, anything that might anchor him to a reality that had just cracked open. I stood frozen. My legs refused to move. My breath shook so hard my teeth chattered. The forest watched. I could feel it. It wasn't done with me. Not even close. Murphy eventually rose, gripping my jacket with trembling fingers. Ridge, listen to me. You can't stay on this job. The longer you're here, the deeper it sees you. His voice was breaking. He was scared, not just of what happened to Connell, but of what was forming in me, because the truth was sinking in, slow and relentless. I had heard the pines whisper. I had felt the hum. I had seen the shadows move wrong. And once you see the forest's secrets, it sees you. I didn't quit. I don't know if it was stubbornness or duty or something else. Something darker. A pull I couldn't resist. But over the weeks that followed, my nights grew restless. My name seemed to echo faintly between the trees. Footprints appeared outside my cabin. The wind would stop abruptly when I stepped outside, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for me to speak first. And sometimes I felt watched even indoors. Yet through all the fear, something else grew inside me, a strange clarity, a respect for the unknown, a fragile acceptance of the fact that the forest is older than our logic, older than our fears, older than our stories, and maybe, just maybe, it chooses certain people not to torment, but to teach. What lesson, I still don't know, but I'm listening now. Even when I don't want to, even when the knocking comes again, even when the hum returns beneath my floorboards, because some stories, the real ones, the ones whispered by locals for generations, are not warnings, they're invitations. And once the pines have spoken your name, they never stop. The first thing you need to understand is this. The forest remembers what we forget. It keeps its own kind of ledger, carved not into paper, but into air, into soil, into the minds of the people who walk beneath its canopy. I didn't believe that when I first started. I thought I was the one keeping watch over the trails, over the people, over whatever wandered too close to camp at night. I told myself I was the steady one, the one rooted like the old-growth pines. But a person can feel steady until the ground shifts under them, until the wind carries a voice that sounds too much like their own. I learned that the forest keeps its stories, and it will tell them when it chooses. My name is not important. My age doesn't matter much either, but I'm far enough along in this line of work to know what normal looks like and what doesn't. I work in the northern ranges, dense country of ponderosa and lodgepole, where the soil is soft underfoot and the silence feels older than speech. The locals call our valley Pine Water, though the original tribal name translates to the place where breath lingers. Tourists never ask what that means. Locals never explain. But anyone who's lived here long enough understands that the forest has edges you don't step past unless you're ready to see things you won't forget. My job began like most ranger jobs do: search and rescue rotations, trail maintenance, wildlife reports, late-night calls about missing hikers who had only stepped off the trail for a minute. I thought the strange stories locals told were just that, stories. The old man at the supply store who claimed shadows followed him home, the husband and wife who said they heard chanting in the tree line during a storm, the kid who swore something tall and pale watched him from the creek bed. You learn to smile, nod, and mentally file those under campfire imagination. For my first couple of years, nothing challenged that neat mental filing system. I saw cougars, black bears, elk, tribes of massive jackrabbits that startled people more than they should. I saw frost creep over tents in patterns that resembled fingerprints, though I didn't think much of it back then. I heard tree knocks echoing at odd hours, but that's not rare out here. Branches fall, wood warps, animals do strange things. We tell ourselves logic explains everything because logic feels safe. But safety is a thin blanket in these woods. My first encounter with real fear came one autumn evening, the kind that sinks early into the land and stains everything with that amber, dying light glow. I was checking a backcountry trail about 6 miles out from the nearest campground, making sure a washed-out footbridge was still passable after recent rains. The air was quiet in that heavy way that suggests weather is considering a change. Too still, too expectant. Even the birds had muted themselves. As I headed deeper, I caught a scent I'd never smelled out here before, like cold stone and wet fur, sharp and metallic, almost like blood but not quite. It hit in a wave, sudden and deliberate, as if something had stepped out onto an invisible threshold. I paused, scanning the undergrowth. Nothing moved, not even a blade of grass. I reminded myself that scent carries strangely in the forest. Temperature shifts bend it. Terrain can funnel it. Animals die. Things rot. This was nothing to worry about. But my instincts, those primal animal things we pretend we don't have anymore, were whispering a different truth. They said, turn back. They said, you're being watched. They said the forest is holding its breath. I pushed on anyway. That's the problem with being trained to investigate danger. You start believing knowledge makes you immune to it. You rationalize until rationalizing becomes another form of denial. Around the next bend, I heard it, a low, rhythmic clicking. Not branches, not insects, not anything I'd heard in all my years tracking wildlife. It sounded too deliberate, too patterned, like someone clacking two stones together in a steady cadence. A signal, a warning, a language. I stopped and listened. The clicking stopped too. I walked. It resumed, soft but insistent. Click, click, click. I knew better than to call out, "Who's there?" That's a movie instinct, not a ranger's. Instead, I crouched low, scanning the trees for movement, shape, color, anything. The forest stayed perfectly still. Then the clicking stopped again. Silence poured in like cold water. A different sound followed, a slow exhale, deep enough to stir the pine needles at my feet. I felt the air shift with it, like something enormous had drawn breath just beyond sight. I wasn't armed beyond a sidearm, which was useless against anything I suspected might be out there. People like to joke about Bigfoot sightings, but I've heard enough professionals talk in private to know that not everyone thinks it's a joke. Some describe something ape-like. Some describe something nearly human. Some describe something neither. I'd always doubted those stories. Until that exhale. I backed away slowly, my boots soundless on the carpet of damp needles. I didn't turn. I didn't run. The forest has predators that chase movement, and I had no intention of inviting pursuit. When I reached a ridgeline far enough that the air warmed and the scent thinned, I finally allowed myself to breathe normally again. Back at the station, I wrote the encounter up as unidentified animal presence, though I didn't mention the clicking. That felt like admitting too much, even to myself. The next morning, a local named Harris, white-bearded, soft-spoken, the kind of man who looks carved from the mountains themselves, leaned against his pickup outside the ranger station and said, almost casually, "You felt it last night, didn't you?" I asked him what he meant. He didn't smile. The pines talk when something old moves. Folks hear it in different ways. Some hear clicking, some hear knocking, some hear nothing at all, just the quiet going wrong. I told him it was probably just an elk or bear. He shook his head. You'd know the difference. We all know the difference. Then he walked away. Locals don't tell stories without reason. They don't embellish. They don't try to scare you for fun. They whisper warnings the way the forest whispers its own. I should have taken his words more seriously. I should have recognized the unease lingering beneath his voice, the kind that only comes from experience, not superstition. But humans are creatures of denial. We file away the uncomfortable truths because accepting them would require changing how we see the world. I wasn't ready to change. Not yet, because that first encounter was only the beginning, and the forest hadn't even started telling its real stories. It would, soon enough. And it would start with the thing that dragged a man into a cave his friends swore didn't exist. The call came 2 days after my encounter, early morning, frost still gripping the tail end of October, the kind that turns pine needles brittle under your boots. 3 hikers from a nearby town had reported their friend missing. They'd been exploring an unmarked ridge trail, one that wasn't technically illegal to wander onto, but wasn't smart either. According to them, the man, Jonas, had walked ahead around a bend, then simply wasn't there anymore. No scream, one of them insisted when I questioned him. No struggle, no branches snapping. He was just gone. People don't vanish like that, I thought. But the dread in my stomach told me otherwise. The 3 men were young, late 20s, early 30s, each one carrying the same expression, a hollow confusion paired with a terror they were trying not to show. Trauma has a way of sanding the edges off a person's face, leaving behind a kind of stunned smoothness. I'd only seen it a handful of times before, once after a cougar attack, once after a lost hiker was found hypothermic and hallucinating, but never this clearly, and never on 3 faces at once. We gathered near the ridge they'd pointed out on the map. The air tasted metallic again, faint but familiar. A thin sheen of mist clung low to the forest floor, not quite natural for this early in the day. The men led me to the bend where Jonas had disappeared. "He was right there," one said, pointing to a spot 6 feet away. He stopped, said he heard something. Then he stepped off the trail, right there between those two fallen logs. And then he never stepped out, another finished. We looked everywhere. We called his name. It's like the forest ate him. People panic. People exaggerate. But these men weren't lying. You can tell when someone is trying to convince you versus when they're trying to convince themselves. These three weren't doing either. They were reporting something as plainly as recounting the weather. I radioed the station, logged the missing person case, and began the initial sweep. Grid search, markers on trees, calling the missing hiker's name. Standard procedure. But even as I followed protocol, part of me knew it wouldn't be enough. The air around us felt too thick, too laden with a presence I couldn't name. An hour passed. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of struggle. The forest floor was pristine, as if nothing larger than a squirrel had passed through in days. Eventually, I found myself moving beyond the official search perimeter, stepping deeper into the conifers, driven by something between instinct and dread. I didn't call out for Jonas anymore. My voice felt too loud, too disruptive, as if I might call the wrong thing toward me instead. Then I saw it. Not a cave mouth. Not in the way most people imagine. It wasn't a yawning entrance or a gaping black semicircle carved into stone. It was subtler than that. A hollow formed beneath a tangle of roots from a fallen pine, an opening no larger than the width of a doorway, but unmistakably deeper than the surrounding earth should allow. I'd walked this area before. This hollow had never existed. Something had pulled the earth down, or something had pushed it up. The scent hit me next. Stone cold, wet, metallic. The same scent I had smelled 2 nights earlier. The same scent I had convinced myself belonged to a wounded animal or the shifting weather. Now it was too strong to ignore. "Jonas?" I whispered. A sound drifted out from the hollow, so faint I thought I imagined it. A single click. Click. My throat tightened. The hikers hadn't mentioned hearing anything like that, but maybe they hadn't gotten close enough. Maybe the forest doesn't show the same face to everyone. I knelt slowly, shining my flashlight into the hollow. The beam disappeared into a throat of earth, its walls rippling inward as though the ground itself had been scooped out by hands. Too symmetrical, too smooth. Even erosion leaves a pattern. This felt intentional. About 15 feet in, the beam hit something pale. Fabric. A torn piece of shirt. I reached in as far as I could without entering the hollow, stretching my arm until my fingers brushed it. It was damp, cold, human. A shape shifted in the darkness beyond the fabric. Something moved, softly, deliberately. Something breathing. My instincts screamed at me to back away, to get the other rangers, to wait for backup, to not make the mistake so many others make, descending into the unknown alone. But fear can be persuasive in ways courage cannot. It narrows the world into a single point, and that point at that moment was the hollow. Then a voice slid out of the darkness. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clearly human. It was a rasp, like a throat trying to form words through decades of dust. Help. The sound nearly rooted me to the spot. The timber was wrong, too deep, too wet, but the word was unmistakable. My chest tightened. I've responded to real distress calls. I know the cadence, the urgency, the irregular breathing. This voice was different, hollow, echoing wrong. It repeated, "Help," but this time the voice sounded closer to Jonas's age. Closer, but not right, like someone trying to mimic him from memory. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. The forest was testing me. The hollow was testing me. And if Jonas was inside, if he was hurt, time was the enemy. Against every instinct I had left, I crouched lower and angled my flashlight deeper into the opening. A face appeared. Not suddenly, not in a jump scare flash. It eased into the beam of the light as though drifting forward out of the earth itself. Pale, almost colorless, eyes too reflective, as if they caught the light rather than absorbed it. It looked like Jonas, at first, but the proportions were wrong. Cheeks a little too narrow, eyes a little too far apart, mouth a little too still, like a half-remembered sketch drawn from someone else's recollection. The face didn't blink. It didn't react to the light. It just hovered, inches above the soil, its mouth slightly parted. I whispered, "Jonas?" The face tilted, not in recognition, but in mimicry, an echo of human movement, the kind you see when an animal tries to imitate something it doesn't quite understand. Then it spoke again. "Help?" The voice was identical to the first attempt, strained, copied, like someone practicing the shape of human language without ever having used it before. The temperature around me dropped so fast I felt my breath crystallize. Something moved behind the face. Something large. The soil trembled. The pale face slowly receded backward, drawn into the darkness by unseen limbs. I scrambled away from the hollow, heart pounding, adrenaline turning my muscles fluid and useless. I didn't look back. I didn't aim my flashlight inside again. I just ran until the forest lightened enough to feel like itself again. When I returned with a team hours later, the hollow was gone. Not covered. Gone. The roots had knitted back into the soil. The earth was flush with the forest floor. No sign of disruption, no disturbed soil, no torn fabric, nothing. Jonas's friends searched with us until dusk. We found no tracks, no tools, no backpack. Nothing but the echo of their fear still clinging to the trees. Officially, the case went unsolved. Unofficially, Pinewater whispered a new name to itself. And I started to understand why locals avoid the caves they swear aren't there. You'd think that after an encounter like that, I would have taken time off, filed for leave, transferred out, talked to someone. But fear doesn't always push you away from the thing that caused it. Sometimes it pulls you closer, tightening its grip until curiosity becomes its own kind of sickness. I told myself I needed answers. I told myself a ranger doesn't back down. But the truth was simpler and darker. I needed to convince myself it hadn't been real. That's how the forest gets you. For the next few weeks, the routine work kept me far from the ridge. Visitor reports, school tours, campsite safety checks, all the things that made the forest feel normal again. But every time the wind shifted just right, or the air cooled a little too fast, I smelled that metallic note under the pine scent. It was faint, but present, like the forest letting me know it remembered. One evening, just past sunset, a local I'd known for years stopped by the station. Her name was Marla, mid-50s, wiry, hair always tied in a tight braid that made her look younger. She'd lived near Pinewater since she was a kid, and she had the sort of intuition that comes from a lifetime of paying attention to the woods. She didn't come inside. She just stood in the doorway and said, "You've been hearing them, haven't you?" I felt my pulse thud. Hearing what? Her eyes narrowed. The voices that aren't voices. The ones that try shapes of words instead of making them. I froze, not because of what she said, because she said it like she was describing rain or frost, something normal, expected. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. She crossed her arms. "Long enough to know not to follow the sounds. Long enough to know not to look caves in the eye. There aren't caves." She tilted her head in a way that made it clear she knew I didn't believe that anymore. "No," she said quietly, "not for you to find twice." I stepped outside with her. The early winter cold gnawed at the air, filling the station porch with that hollow silence that always made the forest feel like it was listening. "What happened the last time someone got taken?" I asked. Her lips tightened. "Why do you think people whisper about the pines?" She scanned the tree line. "Some disappear because of stupidity, some because of weather, but some are swallowed by the old ones, the ones that don't walk like us, the ones that don't hunt like animals, the ones that mimic so they can get close." The word mimic hit harder than I expected. I remembered the face in the hollow, the way it shifted like someone sculpting a memory out of mud. "What are they?" I whispered. Marla didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the forest, eyes distant, as though searching for something that wasn't visible but was always present. "They're older than the stories," she finally said. "Older than our words for them. My grandmother said they lived under the roots, that the trees were their breath, the soil their ribs. They don't like light, they don't like noise, they don't like being seen. They prefer to pull you down where you can't scream. I felt something cold coil in my stomach. She continued, and they don't take people who fight. They take people who hesitate. Hesitate. Exactly what I had done at the Hollow. Her voice softened. Stay out of the deep ridges. Especially now. Winter wakes things. Before I could ask anything else, she walked away, her boots moving silently over the frost, and I was left on the station porch feeling like the forest had grown eyes. A few days later, I found myself on an early morning patrol near the northern boundary, the coldest, densest part of Pine Water. It was a quiet assignment, one I usually enjoyed because the solitude helped me think. But ever since Jonas, solitude had stopped feeling like a comfort and started feeling like a risk. I followed the trail markers up toward a lookout point where the snow draped over branches in heavy folds. My breath fogged in steady bursts, ghost-like in the pale morning light. Everything was still and cold and normal until it wasn't. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting, a soft rustle behind me, subtle enough to ignore. Then another, a little closer. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. But the rustling didn't stop this time. It grew steadier, almost rhythmic, like something dragging across bark, not leaves, not branches swaying, something heavier. The forest was too silent for that sound to be anything natural. I gripped my radio. Dispatch, this is North Patrol. Hearing something unusual, possible animal follow. Static. No response. I tried again. Still nothing. Cold prickled up my spine. That's when the knocking started. A low thud, followed by another. Measured, heavy, resonant. It wasn't the sound of falling wood. I know falling wood. This was slower, intentional. Thud, thud, thud. Always 3, never 2, never 4. I backed up along the trail, keeping my flashlight trained toward the trees even though daylight was rising. The knocking grew louder, closer, but I still couldn't see movement. It felt like the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing between trunks, vibrating through the frozen earth. Hello, I called out before I could stop myself. The forest inhaled, not the wind, not the air, the forest. And then clicking, soft at first, then sharper, click, click, click. Exactly the rhythm from the Hollow. I felt stripped of warmth, like the cold had reached beneath my skin. The clicking moved around me in a half circle, never too close, but never far. If I took a step forward, it adjusted. If I turned, it shifted. It was tracking me. I raised my sidearm even though it felt useless. Identify yourself, I shouted. The clicking stopped. Dead silence. Then a voice came from the trees behind me. My voice. Same tone, same cadence, same breath pattern. Identify yourself. I spun so fast I nearly slipped on the frost. No one stood there, just pines. Endless pines. Identify yourself, the voice repeated, this time from the left, then from the right, then from behind me again. 4 directions, all my voice, all wrong. I knew enough not to respond. Mimickers, if that's what these things were, learn from what you give them. My grandmother used to tell me that as a kid, though back then it was just a story about owls that could speak your name. But something deeper, something inherited, something instinctual, whispered, don't let it learn you. The forest shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. The trees felt closer, the air tighter, the silence louder. And for the first time, I felt not like I was standing in the forest, but like I was standing inside something alive. That's when I saw the tracks, not footprints, drag marks. Something had been pulled through the snow, wide, deep grooves like a body being hauled by the ankles. They led off the trail and down into a thicker grove of pines. I knew I shouldn't follow them, but I also knew tracks don't lie. If someone was alive, they needed help. If someone wasn't alive, we needed answers. So I stepped off the trail. Each step sank deep into the snow. The temperature plummeted with every foot I traveled. Soon, I could see my breath freezing at the edges before dissipating. The drag marks ended at the base of a massive pine, and at its roots, another hollow. Larger this time, wide enough for a grown man to step into. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself. Inside, the darkness seemed to pulse softly, inhaling and exhaling like it was alive, and something shifted just out of sight. Then a voice drifted out, but not my voice this time, a man's voice, weak, broken. "Please help, Jonas." It had learned him perfectly. I took one step back, then another. The darkness crawled forward, slow, reaching, not with hands, with something else, something jointed, and I knew with a clarity that settled in my bones, if I didn't run now, I wouldn't come back. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was staring into the hollow, the next my legs were already moving, boots slamming against the frozen ground, breath tearing from my chest like fabric. The forest felt steeper than before, the incline sharper, the trees leaning inward as if the woods themselves were trying to slow me down. Snow kicked up in frantic sprays behind me as I sprinted, slipping once, twice, catching myself by instinct rather than skill. Behind me came the sound, not footsteps, not pursuit, something scraping the earth in long, methodical strokes, like branches dragged by a giant, like claws as long as my arms scoring the soil, and underneath it, breathing, wet, heavy, uneven. I didn't dare look back. The trail reappeared in front of me like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. As soon as my boots hit its hard-packed surface, the air lightened, the temperature rose, and the oppressive pressure on my spine loosened. But the danger wasn't gone. I could feel the forest watching me, listening to the weight of each step as I ran. Only when I reached a clearing, a wide stretch of open ground beneath a break in the canopy, did I stop. My lungs burned. My vision blurred at the edges. Every instinct told me to keep running, but exhaustion anchored my legs. The clearing felt wrong. It wasn't wrong visibly, just snow, grass, frostbitten sagebrush, but something in the atmosphere was off. The air held no sound, no wind, no rustling branches. Even my breathing felt muted, as if the cold had swallowed it. Then I noticed the tracks, not the drag marks this time. Footprints, human, barefoot. They circled the clearing in a wide ring, toes pointed inward as if whoever made them had walked around and around the open ground, watching, waiting. Each print was crisp, new, not snowed over. Whoever left them had been here minutes before. My heart hammered. The ring of prints began closing inward, circles tightening, spiraling toward the center of the clearing. And the last print stopped exactly where I stood. I stepped back fast, boots slipping on frost. My breath caught in my throat. More footprints appeared then, not appearing in real time, not forming prints in the snow, but becoming visible as I noticed them. They led out of the clearing toward a cluster of tightly packed pines. They were perfectly spaced, as if someone had walked calmly into the darkest part of the forest and simply vanished. I knew I should call for backup. I should document the prints. I should mark coordinates. I should do anything except walk toward them. But something pulled at me. Not physically, not like the hollows. This was psychological, an itch in the mind, a tug in the instincts, something that said, if you don't understand this, you'll never survive the next one. I followed the prints, step by step, until I reached the tree line. The shadows swallowed light faster here, even the air felt thicker, like breathing through damp cloth. Then I smelled it again. Cold stone and wet fur, sharper than before, heavy enough to sting the back of my throat. I pressed forward, flashlight beams slicing the layers of darkness between the trees. That's when I saw her, a woman, standing between the pines, barefoot in the snow, her thin dress torn at the hem. Her hair hung in tangled strands across her face. Her skin was pale, too pale, as if color had drained out of her long ago. She shivered, but not from cold, more like someone mimicking what shivering is supposed to look like without feeling it. "Ma'am," I called out gently, "are you lost? Are you injured?" She didn't respond. I took another step toward her, careful, slow. Her head tilted, not like a person acknowledging a sound, but like a puppet whose strings had been yanked by the wrong hand. Her hair shifted, revealing her face. Her eyes were wrong, not empty, not lifeless. Too full of reflected light that shouldn't have been there, swirling faintly under the surface like water disturbed beneath moonlight. Her pupils didn't contract. They didn't track the beam of my flashlight. They just stared through me. "Help," she whispered. but her lips barely moved. The sound came 2 seconds too late, like an echo from a separate room. I felt cold clamp onto the base of my spine. "Where did you come from?" I asked. Her head tilted again, too far this time, like she didn't understand the mechanics of her own neck. Then she repeated the word, "Help." Exactly the same pitch, exactly the same breath, exactly the same delay. My radio crackled suddenly in my hand, loud in the stillness, startling enough that I flinched. "North Patrol, copy, we're trying to reach you. Over." The woman blinked, once, slow. Her pupils rolled not toward the radio, but toward the direction of the sound, as if tracking something inside the noise. I took a step back. She took a step forward. Her movement was wrong, not fluid, not natural. A fraction too smooth, a fraction too delayed, as if someone else was controlling her body with invisible wires. "Stop right there," I warned, hand hovering over my sidearm. "Don't come any closer." She stopped. Then her mouth stretched into a smile. It was too wide, too forced, teeth too even, as if she had learned to smile by copying someone else's memory of it. The forest behind her rustled, not like wind, not like animals. Heavy, intentional, something large moving in the shadows. She turned her head toward it, tilting again at that unnatural angle. Then she looked back at me and whispered a new word. "Leave." My blood ran cold, not because of the word itself, but because this time the voice didn't sound copied. It sounded real, urgent, terrified. Her expression changed in an instant, panic flooding her eyes so fast it felt alien, like she was fighting herself. Her fingers twitched, her jaw clenched, her body shook with effort. "Leave," she repeated, a strangled whisper. "Please, go." The rustling behind her grew louder. Branches snapped. Something huge exhaled. I stumbled backward, her face contorted, fear battling against whatever force was pulling her strings. For a moment, she looked human, painfully human, a trapped animal wearing a human mask. Then something in the darkness reached toward her. I saw only a silhouette. Tall. Too tall. Arms too long. Fingers grazing the ground. Its outline shimmered like heat distortion, like reality bending around it. She screamed, not with her mouth but with her eyes, her body rigid with terror. "Run," she gasped, her voice breaking. I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted, adrenaline ripping through my body. The forest blurred as I ran, branches clawing at my arms, snow crashing under my boots. Behind me, I heard her scream cut off in a wet choke. Then, silence. Complete. Utter. Silence. I burst into the clearing, nearly collapsing from the momentum, then kept running until the trail widened into a ranger road. Only when the station came into view did I let myself slow down. My chest felt on fire. My legs shook, my hands trembled uncontrollably, but the fear didn't stay at the station. It followed me inside. It sat with me in the empty dorm room. It lingered behind every window, every dark corner. Because I knew two things now with sickening clarity. The forest wasn't just hiding something. It was trying to contain it. And whatever lived beneath the pines didn't always stay underground. Sleep didn't come easily after that. When it did come, it brought dreams of pale faces drifting through hollowed roots, of voices wearing the wrong tone, of eyes that reflected light like water instead of absorbing it. Every time I woke, the room felt colder than when I'd fallen asleep, as if something had been watching me through the gaps beneath the door. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. How could I? Rangers talk about mountain lions, lost hikers, dehydration risks, not mimics inside tree roots or women whose bodies moved like they'd forgotten how to be human. If I tried to explain, I'd end up in front of a department psychologist, sidelined, branded unstable, and even worse, the forest would still be out there, unchanged, waiting. But a strange thing happened over the next week. The woods grew quiet, not normal quiet, not winter quiet. A deep, unnatural hush settled across Pinewater like a thick blanket. Calls dropped, visitor numbers thinned to almost nothing, animal activity plummeted. No tracks, no scat, no distant bugle of elk. The forest felt emptied, as if every living thing had retreated deeper underground. Locals noticed it too. At the gas station, I overheard an older couple whisper that the pines were holding their breath. A teenager told her father she felt like the trees were turning their faces away. Even the dogs, usually barking at everything, stood with their tails down, staring into the tree line as if waiting for something to emerge. I tried to rationalize it. Weather fluctuation, seasonal migration, natural ebb and flow. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest was wounded, or afraid. The turning point came one afternoon when I was assigned to inspect an old ranger outpost deep in the northwest quadrant, an area rarely visited except for maintenance checks. The place had been abandoned since the 80s, a leftover relic from a time when the service believed in scattering cabins throughout the wilderness like breadcrumbs. Now it was mostly used to store outdated gear and trap cameras. I drove as far as the ranger road allowed, then hiked the remaining 2 miles in. The air was colder here, colder than it should have been. The kind of cold that creeps beneath your coat and curls around your ribs. The outpost sat in a shallow basin surrounded by towering lodge poles. Its wooden walls were gray with age, roof sagging slightly under decades of winter. As I approached, something about the building felt wrong, not dangerous, but hollow, deserted in a way that suggested not abandonment, but evacuation. The front door creaked open as I approached, not from the wind, from movement. I stopped dead in my tracks. Not again, I thought. Not here, but the inside stayed still. No footsteps, no rustling, just the faint smell of dust and old cedar. I stepped through the doorway slowly, flashlight sweeping across the room. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Old stove, wooden bunk, metal lockers, toolboxes. But the dust patterns were strange, circular, almost like something had been dragging itself across the floor in slow spirals. My throat tightened. I checked the back room. Empty. The storage closet, empty. Even the crawlspace hatch was undisturbed. I exhaled, letting some of the tension bleed out. That's when I heard it. A single knock. Soft, deliberate. On the outside wall of the cabin. Right behind me, I spun, flashlight catching on the wooden boards. No shadow, no movement, just the echo of the knock fading into the walls. Then another. Knock. Slower this time, from the opposite side of the cabin. My pulse jumped. Knock. Behind me again. 3 knocks. Always 3. The same pattern I'd heard in the forest, the same echo I'd felt in my ribs days before. I backed toward the center of the room, heart hammering, scanning every crack, every window, every shadow. "Who's there?" I whispered. Nothing answered. Not at first. Then, just like before, the mimicry began, my voice sliding through the walls in a low, unnatural murmur. "Who's there?" It sounded distant at first. Then closer, then right behind me. I spun again, hand trembling on my sidearm. Still nothing. My flashlight flickered. Not from dying batteries, from interference, electromagnetic disturbance. Something was close. The temperature plunged. Frost formed at the corners of the window frames, crackling quietly as it spread. Then the knocking stopped, and the breathing began. A slow, dragging inhale. A wet, shuddering exhale. Not human. Not animal. Something older. Something that had learned to mimic breath, but had never needed lungs. The sound circled the cabin, first along the walls, then above me, crawling across the roof like a massive insect. I dropped to one knee, steadying myself. The world narrowed to a single point, the growing shadow beneath the front door. It spread slowly like ink seeping under the wood, too dark, too smooth. Then a hand slipped through the gap. Except it wasn't a hand, it was long. Jointed, pale as bone, fingers wrong, bent in curves that defied anatomy. It stretched across the floor, reaching, tasting the air. The whisper that followed wasn't a voice. It was an imitation of one. "Help!" I scrambled backward, stumbling over an old crate. My flashlight clattered across the floor, but kept shining, right onto the thing now pushing beneath the door. Its arm extended farther, elbows scraping the floorboards, joints bending backward with soft pops. Another hand followed, then part of a shoulder, something forcing its way through a space far too small. I grabbed the crate, shoved it against the door, then dragged a second one over. The wood strained. The hinges groaned. Something on the other side pushed harder, making the entire frame quake. Then it stopped, not retreated, stopped, silent, listening. I held my breath. Something pressed to the door. I could feel it, not physically but mentally, like fingers brushing the edges of my thoughts. Then it whispered again, but not help. This time it said my name, perfectly, softly, as if it had known it forever. I felt the blood drain from my face. I hadn't told anyone what I saw. I hadn't spoken my name in the woods. I hadn't left evidence behind. But the forest had learned me anyway, or the thing beneath it had. The whisper repeated, sliding under the door like a draft. My name, drawn out, inviting, claiming. I backed toward the window, sliding it up just enough to escape. The cold outside hit me like a wall, but it felt safer than the air inside the cabin. I climbed out, dropped into the snow, and ran. Behind me, the cabin door splintered. Not burst, not cracked. It bowed, wood straining like something heavy leaned against it from the inside. I didn't look back. I ran until the forest changed again, until the oppressive pressure lifted, until the air warmed, until birdsong returned in faint, trembling notes. Only then did I stop. Only then did I realize what the locals meant when they said the pines whispered. They weren't talking about the trees. They were talking about the thing hiding in the spaces between them. And I finally understood why the forest felt wounded. Something underground had woken, and it wanted more than voices. It wanted people. I made it back to the station long after dark, legs numb, throat raw from breathing frozen air. The other rangers had already signed off for the night, but even if they'd been there, I wouldn't have known what to say. My clothes smelled like the deep pines. Wet soil, cold stone, something metallic threading through it like a warning. I stood in the locker room for what felt like an hour, hands pressed to the metal sink, trying to steady the tremor running through me. Every excuse I'd relied on, stress, tricks of the light, misidentification, had been stripped away. You can call something imagination only until it calls you by name. I splashed cold water on my face, grabbed my jacket, and stepped back outside. I needed air, or space, or maybe just the illusion of control. The moon was a thin blade over the tree line, carving a pale arc across the sky. The forest looked calm from this distance, but I knew that was a lie. The quiet wasn't peace. It was anticipation. I leaned against the railing at the edge of the station, staring into the dark, trying to make sense of everything. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, soft but purposeful. I turned sharply, hand instinctively brushing the grip of my sidearm. It was Marla. She stood just outside the halo of the porch light, breath fogging in faint curls. Her face looked older than it had a week ago, tired in a way that spoke more of fear than age. "You saw them," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I exhaled slowly. "Something is moving in this forest that shouldn't exist." She nodded. "It always existed. You just hadn't crossed its path yet." "What are they?" My voice cracked. I need an actual answer. Her eyes drifted toward the tree line. My grandmother called them root spirits. My uncle called them the deep ones. A friend of mine who spent his life tracking strange sounds called them mimic walkers. But none of those words matter. Words are for things that can be explained. I swallowed hard. They take people. They take people who hesitate, she corrected. People who follow the wrong sound. People who listen when they shouldn't. Her gaze met mine, steady, haunted. They took my brother. The air left my chest. She took a shaky step closer. Years ago, same pattern as Jonas. He heard someone calling for help. He went into a hollow in the roots. I never saw him again. The silence hung between us like a weight. I went looking for him, she continued. More times than I'll admit, and every time they nearly got me, but they didn't understand my voice yet. They couldn't mimic what they didn't know. "But they know mine now," I whispered. Her expression tightened. "Yes, and that means you're marked." The word hit harder than I expected. Marked. Not hunted, not followed. Marked, as if I'd been unknowingly claimed. "So what do I do?" I asked. "Run? Quit? Leave Pinewater?" She shook her head. "You've lived here too long. The forest knows you now. Running won't help." She hesitated. "But there is something you can do." I waited. "Tell your story," she said. "Speak what you've seen. Not to the public. They'll only mock you. Not to your superiors. They'll only bench you. Tell it to the forest, aloud, under the pines, directly to them." I frowned. "Why?" Because the forest listens, it remembers, and it decides what belongs and what doesn't. That sounds like superstition. She held my gaze. And yet here you are, talking about creatures under the roots. Fair point. Go, she said softly, before the snow falls thicker, before the ground freezes shut, before they change again. I didn't know what compelled me to obey. Desperation, maybe, or curiosity, or the growing sense that if I didn't confront this thing, if I didn't acknowledge it, my fear would rot me from the inside. I walked into the woods alone. The night tightened around me as I left the safety of the station behind. The first mile felt normal. Familiar trails, predictable wind. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to lean inward, branches drawing together overhead like ribs forming a cage. Finally, I reached a clearing where moonlight poured through a break in the canopy. The ground here was bare except for frost and brittle grass. I stood in the center, breath steadying, heartbeat slowing. And then I began to speak. Not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. I told the forest about the clicking, about the dragging hollows under the roots, about Jonas vanishing without a sound, about the woman whose voice wasn't her own, about the hand slipping beneath the cabin door, about hearing my name whispered in a place where names should stay silent. I told it about the fear, the denial, the shame of running. The weight of knowing something ancient had learned me like a familiar tune. The forest didn't respond, not at first, but the silence changed. It deepened, thickened. The air around me grew colder, sharper, humming with a faint vibration that prickled along my skin. Something was listening, and I realized then that the story wasn't just for the forest, it was for myself. Because speaking fear out loud forces it into a shape you can understand. And once it has a shape, it can be confronted. When I finished, my breath trembled in the freezing air. I waited. Nothing moved, nothing emerged, nothing whispered. For a moment, I felt foolish. Then, the pines stirred, not from wind, from acknowledgement. Branches rustled in a slow, sweeping wave around the clearing as though a circle had been completed. And deep under the earth, faint enough to be imagined but too deliberate to dismiss, came a long, low exhale, like something settling back into sleep. The air warmed, just slightly. The pressure lifted, and the forest released me. Not fully, not forever, but enough. Enough to walk back safely, enough to breathe without feeling watched, enough to know I'd been heard. By the time I reached the station, dawn was streaking the horizon with thin lines of pale gold. Marlo's truck was gone. The world looked almost normal, but Pinewater had changed, and so had I. You don't come back from something like this as the same person. Fear, when it digs deep enough, carves out new rooms inside you. Rooms filled with echoes. Rooms filled with sharpened instincts. Rooms where darkness sits quietly until it's needed. I still patrol the forest. I still answer calls. I still track hikers who wander too far. But now I move differently. Listen differently. Respect the silence with a reverence I never had before. Because I know what sleeps beneath these roots. I know what mimics the voices of the lost. I know what drags the hesitant into the hollows. And I know what waits for winter. Locals still whisper stories about the pines, about the caves that move, about voices that shouldn't exist, about disappearances that happen too quietly to make the news. But what they don't say, the thing they understand deep in their bones, is this. The spirits of the deep woods are not malicious. They are ancient. They are hungry. And they remember every soul that walks their ground. And now they remember me. So if you ever find yourself wandering through Pinewater, or any forest like it, remember this. When the trees fall silent, when the air cools too fast, when a voice calls your name from the shadows, don't look back, don't answer, don't hesitate. The forest is always listening, and some things beneath the roots are waiting for the moment you do.